New Year's Eve is supposed to be about fresh starts, midnight kisses, fireworks, a countdown that promises everything bad is finally behind you. But what if the night that was meant to erase the past ended someone's future instead? Inside a quiet American neighborhood, a New Year's party was in full swing. Music was loud, drinks were flowing, laughter filled the room. And then, just minutes after midnight, everything stopped. No one outside heard a scream. No one called for help right away. And when police finally arrived, the house looked normal. Except for one thing that could never be undone. Everyone at that party said the same thing. It all happened so fast. But investigators would soon discover that this night didn't begin at midnight. It began with silence, with tension no one wanted to acknowledge, and with a choice that someone made, believing no one would ever know. So the real question isn't just what happened that night. It's this: when the countdown ended, who was already hiding the truth? New Year's Eve is supposed to mean fresh starts, second chances, champagne popping at midnight, and the illusion that whatever went wrong last year can be erased in the next 5 seconds of a countdown. Streets glow with fireworks, living rooms turn into dance floors, and phones buzz with New Year, New Me messages that people half believe and half type just to feel less alone. But on this particular New Year's Eve, inside a quiet suburban home, the celebration didn't lead to a new beginning. It led to something far darker, something that would leave investigators asking the same question for years afterward. How does a party meant to celebrate life turn into a crime scene before the clock even strikes 12? The house sat in what looked like the safest kind of American neighborhood. The kind with trimmed lawns, wide driveways, and neighbors who waved but didn't really know each other. Nothing about the place screamed danger. No police tape, no past disturbances, no violent history tied to the address. If you were driving by that night, you would have seen cars lined up along the curb, music leaking faintly through the walls and silhouettes moving behind the curtains. Just another New Year's party. Just another countdown waiting to happen. But what no one outside could see was that tensions were already simmering inside that house, quietly building with every drink poured and every unresolved argument brushed aside with a fake smile. The guest list wasn't huge, mostly friends, co-workers, and a few friends of friends. That detail would later matter a lot. This wasn't some wild open invite party where strangers came and went freely. These were people who knew each other, at least on the surface. People who had shared drinks before, laughed together, maybe even trusted each other. And that's what makes what happened next so unsettling. Because when violence comes from a stranger, it's frightening. But when it comes from someone already inside the room, that's when fear gets personal. As the night went on, alcohol flowed easily. Beer bottles piled up in the kitchen trash, red cups scattered across countertops, and a bottle of champagne sat chilling in the fridge, waiting for midnight. Music shifted from upbeat party tracks to louder, bass-heavy songs as the night deepened. People danced, people argued, people flirted, and people noticed things, small things, that didn't feel right. A tense exchange in the hallway. A raised voice quickly lowered when someone walked in. A stare that lingered just a little too long. At the time, none of it seemed important enough to ruin the night. After all, it was New Year's Eve. Everyone wanted to believe the night would end with cheers, not sirens. But investigators would later reconstruct this evening minute by minute, and when they did, one question kept resurfacing. At what exact moment did this night cross the point of no return? Was it when a private argument turned public? When jealousy mixed with alcohol? Or when someone made a decision they couldn't take back, even before they fully understood it themselves? Just before midnight, guests gathered in the living room. Phones were raised, ready to record the countdown. Someone turned the TV up louder as the familiar numbers appeared on screen. 10, 9, 8. Laughter filled the room. 7, 6. Someone spilled a drink and laughed it off. 5, 4, 3, 2. And then something happened that shattered the moment completely. Not everyone heard it at first. Some thought it was a firework. Others thought a speaker had blown out. But within seconds, confusion turned into panic and celebration turned into chaos. A body lay on the floor. The music stopped. Screaming replaced laughter. Phones that were seconds away from filming fireworks were now capturing something no one ever once recorded. Blood. Real blood. Spreading across a living room rug that had been vacuumed just hours earlier. Someone shouted to call 911. Someone else froze, unable to move, unable to process what they were seeing. And in the middle of all that noise, one detail stood out to first responders when they arrived. The killer hadn't run. Police arrived to a scene that felt almost unreal. Half-filled drinks still sat on tables. Party decorations hung awkwardly from the ceiling. A digital clock on the microwave glowed just minutes past midnight. It was already the new year. And yet, instead of toasts and resolutions, officers were stepping carefully around shattered glass and stunned partygoers, trying to understand how a celebration had turned deadly so fast. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a version, and almost all of them contradicted each other. From the very beginning, this case refused to make sense. Detectives separated witnesses, pulling people into bedrooms, the garage, even outside into the cold night air. The same questions were asked again and again. Where were you standing? Who were you talking to? What did you see? What did you hear? And the answers painted a messy, fragmented picture. Some claimed they heard shouting earlier in the night. Others insisted everything was fine until the final moments. A few said they saw someone holding something in their hand but couldn't describe it clearly. Alcohol blurred memories. Shock distorted timelines. And fear made people hold back details they weren't ready to admit out loud. The victim, lying motionless in the center of the living room, wasn't a random guest. They were someone with connections inside that house, someone whose presence had already caused tension earlier in the night. That fact alone shifted the investigation in a crucial direction. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't an accident involving fireworks or celebratory gunfire. This was personal. And when a crime is personal, motives hide in relationships, grudges, secrets, and moments people wish they could rewind. As detectives scanned the room, one thing became painfully clear. Everyone at that party was a potential witness and a potential suspect. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of an outsider crashing the celebration. Whoever did this was already inside when the countdown started. They laughed, they drank, they waited. Or maybe they didn't plan it at all. Maybe it happened in a split second, driven by emotion rather than intention. And that possibility would haunt this case from start to finish. The next few hours would define the investigation. Phones were collected, text messages reviewed, social media posts frozen in time. Because while people were still in shock, their digital footprints were already telling stories they hadn't realized they were sharing. A tense message sent earlier that evening. A photo with someone cropped out. A deleted post that investigators would later recover. In the modern era, crimes don't just happen in real life. They happen online too, and every click leaves a trace. As dawn approached, the party house no longer looked like a place of celebration. Yellow tape surrounded it. News vans lined the street. Neighbors watched from their windows, wondering how something so violent could happen so close to home. And inside police headquarters, detectives stared at a whiteboard slowly filling with names, arrows, and unanswered questions. Who snapped? Who lied? And who was still hiding the truth? Because here's the question that would define this case and keep the public obsessed with it long after the headlines faded. If dozens of people were in the room, how did no one see exactly what happened? And maybe even more disturbing, did someone see it and choose not to speak? By the time the sun came up on January 1st, the house no longer belonged to the people who had celebrated inside it just hours earlier. It belonged to the investigation. Every room was photographed, every surface dusted, every footprint mapped as if detectives were trying to freeze time itself. But the problem was time had already fractured, the party had blurred memories, alcohol had softened details, and shock had rewritten timelines in the minds of witnesses. From the very start, investigators realized they weren't just solving a murder, they were untangling dozens of competing realities, all happening in the same living room at the same moment. The first major focus was the victim's final hours. Who were they speaking to? Who were they avoiding? And most importantly, who had a reason to be angry enough to cross a line on the one night of the year meant for forgiveness and fresh starts? Friends described the victim as confident, outspoken, and not afraid of confrontation. That detail mattered, because confident people often step into conflicts others avoid, and outspoken people don't always realize when they've pushed the wrong person too far. Investigators learned that earlier in the night the victim had been involved in a tense exchange. Nothing physical, nothing loud enough to shut the party down, but intense enough that multiple guests remembered it later. Here's where things got complicated. Everyone remembered the argument differently. Some said it was about money, others said it was about a relationship. A few claimed it was just drunk nonsense that got blown out of proportion. But one detail remained consistent across statements. The argument didn't end cleanly. It wasn't resolved, it was paused. And unresolved conflict has a way of coming back at the worst possible moment. Detectives began pulling phone records, and what they found raised more questions than answers. Text messages sent just hours before the party hinted at resentment that had been building long before New Year's Eve. Passive-aggressive remarks, sarcastic replies, messages that read harmless on the surface but carried emotional weight underneath. One message in particular caught investigators' attention, a short line sent earlier that evening that simply read, "We need to talk tonight." Who sent it? Who received it? And did that conversation ever actually happen, or did it explode before it could finish? As interviews continued, inconsistencies started piling up. One witness said the victim was standing near the couch at the moment everything went wrong. Another insisted they were closer to the kitchen. Someone else claimed the lights were dimmed. Another swore the room was fully lit. Individually, these discrepancies could be chalked up to stress. Collectively, they pointed to something else entirely. Someone wasn't telling the full truth. And detectives knew it. You could see it in the way they repeated questions, slightly reworded each time, waiting for a slip. A detail that didn't line up, a pause that lasted a second too long. Then there was the physical evidence. Whatever caused the fatal injury wasn't immediately obvious to everyone in the room, which added another layer of confusion. Some guests initially thought the victim had collapsed. Others believed it was an accident involving party decorations or a fall. It took first responders only seconds to realize the truth. But those seconds mattered, because in that brief window of confusion, people moved. They stepped back, they stepped away, and in doing so, they altered the scene in ways no one could undo. Investigators zeroed in on one uncomfortable fact. No weapon was immediately visible. That didn't mean there wasn't one. It meant it was either concealed, removed, or so ordinary that no one initially recognized it as a weapon at all. And that possibility terrified detectives, because if the object used was something commonly found in the house, then nearly everyone present had access to it. Suddenly, the suspect pool didn't shrink, it exploded. As hours turned into days, the case began to attract media attention. Headlines focused on the shock value. New Year's party turns deadly and celebration ends in tragedy. But behind the scenes, investigators were growing increasingly frustrated. Tips poured in, many of them useless. Neighbors reported hearing noises that may or may not have been fireworks. Online sleuths speculated wildly, pointing fingers at people based on rumors rather than facts. And in the middle of all that noise, detectives had to stay focused on the only thing that mattered: evidence. Then came the moment that shifted the entire investigation. During a follow-up interview, one witness changed their story, just slightly, but enough to matter. They corrected a timeline, adjusted where they had been standing, added a detail they had forgotten to mention earlier. And that raised a question investigators never take lightly. Was this memory coming back naturally? Or was it being reshaped to protect someone? Pressure mounted. Detectives re-interviewed guests, this time confronting them with contradictions. Some cracked emotionally, breaking down in tears. Others grew defensive, insisting they were being unfairly targeted. One person asked for a lawyer, another stopped cooperating altogether. And that silence? That spoke louder than any words. Because innocent people may be confused, but they rarely shut down completely without a reason. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer one thing became: this wasn't a crime of opportunity. It wasn't a random outburst with no warning signs. The tension had been there all night, simmering beneath the music and laughter. The countdown didn't create the violence, it just marked the moment it finally surfaced. And the most chilling realization of all was this: someone at that party knew exactly what they were capable of before midnight. As forensic results began coming back, detectives finally understood what they were dealing with, and it wasn't what most people expected. The cause of death revealed a level of intent that contradicted early claims of an accident. This wasn't a careless shove. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was deliberate. And once that conclusion was reached, the tone of the investigation changed completely. The gloves came off, but even with that clarity, one massive problem remained. There was still no clear suspect, no confession, no definitive eyewitness, just a room full of people, each carrying their own version of the truth, and at least one of them carrying a secret heavy enough to ruin lives, including their own. And that leaves us with the question investigators were forced to confront next. If everyone saw something, why was no one seeing the same thing? And maybe even worse, what if the key witness wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but the quietest one no one was paying attention to? By the third day of the investigation, the energy inside the police department had shifted from confusion to pressure. Detectives weren't just racing against time anymore. They were racing against memory. Because as hours turn into days, witnesses don't remember more. They remember differently. Stories soften, details blur, and sometimes the truth gets replaced by whatever version feels easiest to live with. Investigators knew that if they didn't lock this case down soon, it would become one of those tragedies people talk about in vague terms. Something bad happened at a party once without ever knowing why or how. The forensic results were the first thing to break through the fog. The autopsy confirmed what detectives had begun to suspect early on, but hadn't been ready to say out loud. This was not an accident. The injury pattern told a story, one of proximity, control, and force applied with intention. This wasn't a shove during a heated moment. This wasn't someone tripping in a crowded room. This was a fatal act that required someone to be close, deliberate, and fully aware of what they were doing. And once that conclusion landed, every witness statement had to be re-examined through a darker lens. Suddenly, moments that once felt insignificant took on new meaning. The way someone blocked a doorway, The reason one person left the room just before midnight and returned seconds later. The fact that someone insisted on cleaning up a spill before police arrived. None of those actions proved guilt on their own, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are what detectives live for. Because people can lie with words, but they struggle to hide behavior. Then there was the digital evidence. Phones that had once been full of party photos were now evidence bags labeled with dates and times. Investigators pulled location data, message logs, deleted texts, even app activity. And buried in that data was something chilling. A sequence of messages sent after the fatal moment, but before police arrived. Messages asking, "Did anyone see?" Messages saying, "Stay calm." Messages that weren't about helping the victim, but about controlling the narrative. And that raised a terrifying question. Was someone already thinking about consequences while another person lay dying? As detectives followed that digital trail, one name began surfacing again and again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. This person hadn't been the center of attention at the party. They weren't the loudest. They weren't the most emotional. In fact, multiple witnesses described them as quiet, normal, barely noticeable. And that's what made investigators uneasy. Because in crime scenes like this, chaos hides people who know how to stay calm. And calm, under the wrong circumstances, can be terrifying. When detectives brought this individual back in for a second interview, the tone changed immediately. The casual cooperation from before was gone. Answers became shorter, eye contact broke. Timelines tightened unnaturally as if rehearsed. And when confronted with inconsistencies, small ones almost invisible to the untrained ear, the response wasn't confusion. It was irritation. That reaction didn't prove guilt, but it did something just as important. It showed fear of being exposed. The breakthrough came from something almost overlooked, a minor detail in the crime scene photos. An object slightly out of place, something so ordinary that dozens of people had handled it that night without a second thought. But under forensic examination, it told a different story. Traces left behind, microscopic, invisible in the chaos, linked that object to the fatal moment. And once that connection was made, the room for denial began to shrink rapidly. Investigators now believed they understood how the crime happened. The remaining mystery was why. Was it rage that finally boiled over? Was it resentment that had been quietly building for months? Or was it something darker, something premeditated, masked by celebration and alcohol, waiting for the perfect distraction? Because New Year's Eve offers exactly that: noise, confusion, movement, and a built-in excuse for chaos. As word of a possible suspect spread quietly through law enforcement circles, the pressure intensified. Media speculation grew louder. Online theories became more aggressive. Innocent people were accused publicly, their lives disrupted by rumors they couldn't control. And in the middle of it all, detectives had to move carefully. One wrong step, one rushed arrest, and the entire case could collapse. But the most haunting part of this phase wasn't the evidence. It was the realization that someone at that party had gone home after midnight, taken a shower, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep, knowing exactly what they had done. While everyone else replayed the night in confusion, this person replayed it with clarity. Every second, every choice, every mistake. And that knowledge has a way of eating at people whether they confess or not. As detectives prepared their next move, one final question loomed over the case like a shadow. If the truth was finally coming into focus, would the person responsible break under pressure? Or would they take this secret to court and force everyone to relive that night all over again? Because once an investigation reaches this point, something always happens. A confession, a slip, or a desperate attempt to stay free. By the time investigators scheduled the next interrogation, They already knew something crucial. This wasn't going to be a dramatic table-flipping confession. This was going to be a slow collapse, the kind where the truth doesn't explode, it leaks, piece by piece, word by word. Because the suspect they were zeroing in on wasn't reckless or impulsive in the traditional sense, they were controlled, careful. Someone who believed that staying calm was the same thing as staying safe. And that belief, detectives knew, was exactly what would undo them. The interrogation room was plain by design. No distractions, neutral colors, a small table, 2 chairs. A camera quietly recording every blink, every shift in posture, every pause between answers. When the suspect walked in, they looked composed, almost offended to be there. They insisted they had already told police everything they knew. They repeated the same line they'd used before. "I just want to help." But seasoned investigators hear that phrase differently, because helping means filling in gaps, and this person was carefully stepping around them. The interview started gently. Detectives revisited the night from the beginning, arrival time, who they greeted, where they stood during the countdown. Nothing accusatory, just repetition. And repetition is powerful. Because when someone is lying, repeating a story forces them to either memorize it perfectly or start changing it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cracks began to show. A time shifted by a few minutes. A person placed in a room they hadn't been in before. A detail added that hadn't existed in earlier statements. Each change was small, but together they painted a picture of someone trying to adjust a story in real time. Then came the strategic pause. Detectives stopped asking questions and let silence do the work. Silence is uncomfortable. It forces people to fill it. And the suspect did, offering explanations that hadn't been requested, clarifying points no one had challenged. That's when investigators knew they were getting close, because innocent people respond to questions, guilty people respond to fear. And fear was now sitting in that room, heavy and unspoken. The turning point came when detectives introduced evidence, not all of it, just enough. A timestamp, a recovered message, a forensic detail that contradicted the suspect's version of events. They didn't accuse. They asked a simple question. "Help us understand this." The suspect hesitated, just for a second. But that second mattered, because in high-stakes moments, hesitation is where truth tries to escape before it gets shoved back down. As pressure mounted, the suspect made a psychological mistake they didn't even realize they were making. They stopped talking about the victim as a person and started talking about the situation as a problem, not what happened to them, but what went wrong. That shift was subtle, but devastating, because it revealed something deeply human and deeply incriminating: emotional distance. And emotional distance after a violent act often signals responsibility. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors were already being briefed. The case was crossing a critical threshold, from investigation to accountability. But prosecutors don't just need suspicion, they need proof that survives scrutiny. They need a story that makes sense not just to detectives, but to 12 strangers in a jury box. And that meant answering the hardest question of all: intent. Was this a momentary loss of control, or was it something that had been building long before the champagne chilled? When the interrogation ended, the suspect walked out without handcuffs, but not without consequences. Surveillance intensified. Conversations were monitored, movements tracked. Because now investigators weren't just listening for lies, they were waiting for behavior to change. And change it did. The suspect withdrew, stopped answering calls, avoided people from the party. Behavior that might look like grief on the surface, but felt more like fear beneath it. Days later, the arrest came quietly. No dramatic takedown, no flashing lights, just paperwork, procedure, and a set of charges that carried the weight of everything that had happened since midnight. The celebration that once filled that house now lived only in evidence files and court transcripts. And as the case moved toward trial, one final truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one violent moment. It was about everything that led up to it and everything that followed. As families prepared for court and the public waited for answers, one haunting question remained at the center of it all. If the countdown had ended 1 second earlier, would anyone still be alive today? Or was this outcome already locked in long before anyone raised a glass? The courtroom didn't look anything like the living room where the celebration had ended in blood. But the weight of that night hung over it just the same. Wooden benches replaced party furniture, fluorescent lights replaced string lights, and silence replaced music, but the tension was identical. This was where stories stopped being personal and started becoming evidence, where memory collided with fact, where every word mattered. And for the families on both sides of the aisle, this wasn't about legal arguments anymore. It was about whether the truth would finally be spoken out loud. Prosecutors built their case slowly, deliberately, knowing that emotion alone wouldn't be enough. They walked the jury through the night step by step, before the party, during the tension, and after the moment everything went wrong. They showed how unresolved conflict had been simmering long before midnight. How alcohol didn't create the violence but removed the barriers that had been holding it back. How digital evidence told a story witnesses couldn't or wouldn't tell themselves. The prosecution didn't paint the accused as a monster. Instead, they painted something more unsettling. A regular person who made a catastrophic decision in a moment where consequences felt distant and invisible. The defense strategy was exactly what investigators had expected. They focused on chaos, on uncertainty, on the idea that no one truly knew what happened in those final seconds. They reminded jurors that the room was crowded, the lights were low, and emotions were high. They questioned witness credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in statements given under stress. And they leaned heavily on a single argument that shows up again and again in cases like this. Reasonable doubt, not innocence, just doubt. Witnesses took the stand one by one, and each testimony reopened the wound. Some spoke confidently, others broke down mid-sentence. A few contradicted themselves without realizing it. And through it all, the accused sat quietly, composed, rarely reacting. That stillness became its own kind of testimony. Some jurors saw it as control. Others saw it as detachment. And that difference in perception would matter more than anyone realized at the time. The most powerful moment came not from a dramatic outburst, but from silence. When prosecutors replayed a key piece of evidence, a message sent in the immediate aftermath of the incident, the courtroom went still. No arguing, no explaining, just the undeniable weight of timing. Because it wasn't what the message said that mattered most. It was when it was sent, before help arrived, before authorities were called. At a moment when attention should have been on saving a life, not managing a story. Closing arguments brought everything back to one unavoidable question. Was this a tragic accident in a chaotic moment? Or the result of choices made long before the countdown reached zero? Prosecutors argued that actions before and after the incident proved awareness, intent, and responsibility. The defense argued that the case was built on assumptions stacked on top of imperfect memories. And then, just like that, it was out of everyone's hands. The jury deliberated longer than many expected. Hours turned into days. Families waited. Media speculated. Online debates reignited. And inside that jury room, 12 people wrestled with the same uncomfortable truth that defines so many real-life crime cases. Certainty is rare, but responsibility still exists. When the verdict was finally read, it didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like closure, heavy, imperfect, and irreversible. Sentencing brought no relief. No outcome could restore what was lost. Statements were read, emotions surfaced. The reality of consequences settled in, not just for the convicted, but for everyone connected to that night. Friendships were gone. Families were fractured. A single evening meant to mark a new beginning had permanently reshaped multiple lives. In the years that followed, the house where the party took place was sold, renovated, changed. New people moved in unaware of the weight the walls once carried. The story faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But for those who lived it, time didn't erase anything. It just made the memories quieter. And sometimes quiet memories are the loudest ones. This case leaves us with an uncomfortable lesson that goes beyond crime statistics and courtroom drama. It reminds us that violence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind laughter. Sometimes it wears the mask of celebration. And sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't the explosion, but the long build-up everyone chooses to ignore. So the final question isn't just about guilt or innocence. It's about awareness. How many warning signs do we overlook because the music is too loud? How many conflicts do we dismiss because it's a party or it's just one night? And how many lives change forever because no one believes something bad could happen when the calendar is about to turn? Because as this case proves, the new year doesn't erase the past. It carries it forward. If you had enjoyed this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friend and family. Signing out. Thank you.